Welcome back, life science learners from the ad. I trust that you guys are refreshed. Let's continue with our lesson. As a recap of what we've been doing, we've been looking at reproduction in vertebrates. Now, it's important that we understand the way forward. We've looked at the reproductive strategies earlier on. Now we've got to look at the types of reproductive strategies that are displayed by different species. Now, there are various different types that we need to look at. Most species have different approaches to various aspects of reproduction, such as how to attract a suitable mate, and that's important in terms of attracting the most favorable mating partner. And we see this displayed in the form of courtship behavior, where individuals will display feathers, they'll call out. So let's unpack that in a while. We also know that fertilization is important. Where it occurs and how it occurs also influences the success of reproduction. Where the embryo develops is key. We'll look at the position and the development of the embryo, how developed the young need to be when they're born or hatched, and we'll refer to that in terms of how the young are either dependent on the parents or can survive soon after hatching or being born by themselves independently. And will the young need to be protected or fed are crucial aspects to understanding the different successes to reproducing successfully. Now, let's unpack what fertilization is. We've looked at fertilization in the past, and we know that fertilization is a process where there's a fusion between the gametes produced by different individuals or the mating individuals. Let's look at how this influences the success of reproduction. It's important that we recognize that as we talk about fertilization, there are two types of fertilizations that can be exhibited by vertebrates. We have external fertilization and internal fertilization. What does this mean? If we go back to fertilization, it's important that we recognize that fertilization is the fusion. If it happens within the body, we refer to that as internal. If it happens externally, it's a different mechanism where the gametes rely on the external factors to bring them together. Courtship behavior. It's important that we recognize that courtship is the ability of species to be able to display some form of behavior that attracts the most favorable offspring. And so the word courting that we refer to is essentially getting to know someone. And so it's important that courtship in animals results in mating and eventually reproduction. Courtship may be simple, involving a small number of chemicals, sometimes visual stimuli, or even auditory stimuli, meaning sounds. Or it may be very complex, involving a series of acts by two or more individuals, using several modes of communication. So we find that courtship might be a very simple method of attracting mates, or it can be very complex, depending on the social organization of the species. Courtship behavior essentially signals to the mating partners to attract another animal for mating and reproduction. Very few amphibians and reptile species display any courtship behaviors, and we see that courtship becomes significantly more extensive and elaborate as we see complexity of species developing. So in your higher order vertebrates, we find that courtship is a significant part of reproduction. Birds and mammals often have elaborate courtship behaviors, and they displays which often attracts the most favorable mates. Strategies that happen during courtship could include the release of chemicals or hormones, and we refer to them as pheromones. It could also involve visual display. As such, brightly colored body parts are displayed, or even auditory. So if we look at the peacock obviously has an elaborate dance that it does, and this is to attract the females. If we think of frogs and how they croak, if we think of birds and the sounds that they make, those are all parts of stimulation that they use to attract the most favorable mate. And why is this important? Generally, in natural selection, we know that those individuals that have the sweetest cries, the sweetest voices, or the most elaborate display of feathers are the ones that are going to be most attractive. And hence we see that even in the success strategies of these individuals. If we go back to fertilization, it occurs outside the female's body, and when it does, we say that it's external. Here we look at the release of eggs and sperm from the male and the female fish. This process is called spawning, and spawning is a process where the sperms and eggs are released externally, and it depends on the current and the environment in which this occurs. We'll find that in order for this to occur, there must be a large number of gametes produced, because those eggs and sperms that are released depend on the environment in which they are to move and to come together and successfully fertilize. So let's try and understand this, that external fertilization mainly occurs in fish and amphibians that are aquatic, essentially living in water. There is very little cooperative behavior that is required between the male and the females. There is often some degree of courtship indicating readiness to mate, but it doesn't get very elaborate. We find that there's courtship in specific mating behaviors ensure that the eggs and the sperm are released at the same time and place to increase the chances of fertilization occurring. Often there are pheromones that are released, and sometimes these pheromones act as chemical stimuli to announce to the other mating partner that the process of reproduction should be timed and that eggs and sperms are released at the same time. We also know that there are a large number of gametes that are produced, and this is produced so that it increases the chance of fertilization occurring. Because it's external and due to the subject of environmental factors affecting them, the chances of fertilization occurring needs to be enhanced by producing a large number of eggs and sperms. So this is quite an energy-intensive process. You often see that the ova secretes specific chemicals to attract the sperm, and that process is called chemotaxis, where the sperm move towards the eggs as a result of chemical attraction, which are chemicals produced by the egg or the ova. And we see these are subtle mechanisms that increase the chances of fertilization occurring. We know that the fertilized egg cells or the zygote develops into the larva that lives on the yolk and plankton in aquatic organisms. The parents do not need to expend any energy to feed the young, so the young actually developed independently with reserve energy in the yolk. So there's very little parental care, if at all. However, the environmental dangers such as predators reduce the probability of the offspring surviving and reaching adulthood. And that is essentially one of the risks involved with external fertilization. We know that internal fertilization is a much more successful technique to ensure fertilization. This occurs inside the female's body, and it does not require water. So because there's the introduction of the sperm into the female reproductive body, you'll find that it's not dependent on water. However, we'll need what we call an organ, and that organ is often referred to as the penis, that is important in introducing the sperm into the reproductive tract. So internal fertilization comes with its own set of challenges. You'll find that for fertilization to occur, there has to be specific mating strategies, and there must be cooperative behavior between the female and the male individuals. And so much fewer offspring are produced. However, the success of external fertilization is significantly less when compared to internal fertilization. Cool. We've got to discuss the development of the egg, and this occurs either internally, externally, or internally as well, with no dependence on the mother. So there are three strategies that we look at: oviparous, ovoviviparous, and viviparous. So when we look at ovipary, we look at organisms that develop where the eggs are outside the female's body, and these eggs hatch outside with no dependence on the mother. So the egg has its yolk, and that egg develops externally with dependence on the young from the yolk in there. We notice that fertilization usually takes place externally. The developing embryo is surrounded by a jelly-like layer, and here's, if we look at, these are frog eggs that are released, and so these are developing outside. There's a large number of gametes that are produced which require lots of energy. The eggs with the yolk are produced which require little energy, and hence the young develop independently. Here we see examples of animals that are producing eggs externally, and they actually have lots of energy in these eggs which are sufficient for the embryo to develop independently in. It's important that we understand that the amniotic egg is a significant structural adaptation for surviving outside the body. Fish and amphibians need water for fertilization. You'll find that your terrestrial animals, such as your birds and your mammals, require specialized structures to protect the developing egg from drying out. And hence we have seen that organisms that live terrestrially have succeeded in reproducing due to the development of an amniotic egg. And essentially an amniotic egg is an egg that has these different structures that allow them to be able to survive and grow independently outside the body. So we see the presence of a yolk sac, and that yolk sac is the energy that is required for the developing young. These eggs often have an external covering, which is a shell that could be a hard shell or a soft leathery shell, and that shell prevents the desiccation or the dehydration of the egg. We also know that there are several layers that are important in the development of the embryo. The amniotic fluid ensures that the young remains hydrated within the egg. So, having looked at the structure, we know that the development of an embryo is relying on the amniotic egg as a successful strategy for animals that show external fertilization or internal fertilization, where the eggs develop outside the body. As we wrap this up, it's important that we recognize that the yolk is important in the development and the independent structures outside the body, which increase their chances of survival. Guys, you've been a wonderful audience. We've looked at reproductive strategies in this segment. Let's have a short break, and I'll see you back in a little while.